Now that I have my paper measured out and labeled, there are a couple of additional labels I would like you to add. In the wet on wet section, divide it in half and write wet on wet salt. As we did the other day, in the detail painting area, divide it in half and write the word resist. In the water splatter and bloom section, divide it in half and write blooms with RA. RA stands for rubbing alcohol. And in the sponge section, divide it in half and write the word plastic wrap in the other half. Our main layout for our watercolor practice here, and where I got a lot of my information from, is by an artist named Lorraine Watry. I will link her video series in the description box down below. To begin, I need to set up my work area. I will, of course, need my paper I am working on. If I am working on a surface that I do not want to get dirty or run the risk of watercolor staining, then I may, or you may, want to cover your work area with newspaper. You will, of course, need a source of water. I'm using a brush bin. You could use a cup with water. You could use a bowl. Anything that's going to hold some water for you. You will want your paints, of course. I am using the cakes, the watercolor cakes. You can, of course, use tubes or liquid watercolor. And you may want to, especially for tubes or liquid watercolor, have a palette to work with when you use those. I have used in the past even something as simple as a styrofoam plate or the plastic lid to a container to work with my watercolors if you don't have a watercolor palette. You will also want your paint brushes, both flat and round paint brushes. You will, of course, need paper towels. Anytime you work with paint, you should always have a source of paper towels nearby. And looking at our techniques that we're going to go over, you will want to see if you have the following items. One would be some sort of paper towel or Kleenex. Another item you will want to look for is a crayon or waxy material like a crayon. You will need some tape. Masking tape will work, and if you happen to know someone who works with watercolors, they may have masking fluid. But tape will also work in this demonstration, and I will be showing both. You will want something to scratch the surface of your paper with. You could use a edge of a ruler. I often use a popsicle stick. If you can get a hold of one, you will want a Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. Just a piece of it. You don't need a whole magic eraser. You'll want some table salt. For this one, you'll want some rubbing alcohol. If you have them available to you, you will want watercolor pencil and sandpaper. You'll of course want a sponge. A natural sponge works best, but you can use almost any type of sponge. And you will want some plastic wrap. So those are some items you'll want to gather, and you'll want to set up your work area before we begin. So a quick review. Remember, watercolor is the process of painting with pigments that are mixed with water. You can find it in cake form, tube form, and liquid form. Watercolor is known for its inherent delicacy and subtlety because it is all about the use of washes and transparent colors. Remember, when working with watercolor, you do need to learn to be patient. And watercolor can be layered, just like when we worked with colored pencils. You can layer watercolor on top of watercolor. This will help create depth, it will help create form and value. When I go to start, you'll notice some of my paints are wet. I've added water to them. I like to add water to my paints to give them a chance to soften up since they are the cake form. It'll start softening up the binding agents and the pigments so that they'll be ready for me to work with. To begin, we're going to start up here in the solid wash area. A solid wash is a semi-transparent layer of color. So I'm going to choose a color. Load up my paintbrush with that color and apply it to my paper. So my goal here with a solid wash is to try to create an even layer of paint . Now that I know what solid wash is, there are some areas of my practice that I will want to apply some solid washes to here at the beginning so that they have time to dry for certain techniques we're going to learn. So another area in which I want a solid wash is the lift and feather out area. So once again, I'm going to choose a color. I'm going to load up my paintbrush and I'm going to apply a solid wash to that area. The next area I want to apply a solid wash to is in my negative painting area, and I would suggest for this one that you use a light color for this process. So I'm going to pick a yellowish orange color or a goldenrod type of yellow for mine. Pick up a little bit more pigment there. My next area in which I want to apply a solid wash is the magic eraser area. That is down here on my paper. So once again, I'm taking my paintbrush, I'm picking up some watercolor paint and applying a solid wash to this area. Get a little bit more pigment there. I'm also going to add a little bit of a solid wash in the sponge area. I'm not going to cover the entire sponge area with solid wash. And before I move on, do you notice how here in my magic eraser and up at my negative painting area I'm getting some puddles? So you can lift those or absorb those by drawing out your paintbrush and coming in those areas. Your paintbrush will absorb that moisture and help get rid of those puddles. So if you do find that occurring, that is one way you can get rid of them. Another way is if you have a stopper or something like a pipette, you can use it to suck up the color. So that is another option you can use to get rid of puddling in your watercolors. So those are the areas right now that I want to apply solid washes and begin to let those dry. There we go. I think we're recording now. After applying my solid washes to my paper to allow them to dry, I'm now coming down here to the masking fluid and tape area, and I'm applying masking fluid. I'm just using a stick I have to apply it. You could use a paintbrush, but realize masking fluid is basically like a glue, like a kind of like a rubber glue type of substance. So if you do use a paintbrush, there is a risk and possibility that you won't get the masking fluid washed out of your excuse me, washed out of your paintbrush. They do sell tools specifically made for applying masking fluid. You could use a popsicle stick even for that. It depends on what you want to mask off, how big of an area, how little of an area. and how much detail or control you need of the application. While I'm in this area, I'm also going to apply some masking tape. Now you could draw an item on your paper, cover it with masking tape, and then carefully with an X-Acto knife, you want to be sure that you don't cut through your masking tape. But you could cut on the lines of your drawing. And the goal is that the masking tape, the tape you're laying down, is going to protect the paper. So it's not going to allow the paint to penetrate the surface of the paper here. So all I did was take a strip and cut some lines with it. And I'm applying those. So now that we have some areas prepped, we're going to move on with some of our other painting areas. So I'm going to come up top here to glazing. And glazing is a transparent layer of color that is often overlapped. So to begin this process, since this is another one in which we need the material to dry, the paint to dry, I'm going to apply a color, and I want it to be thin, so I don't want as much pigment. So I'm picking up some paint and I'm dipping my paintbrush in some water because I want to thin out that paint. So it's a little bit too thin. I'm going to add a little bit more pigment, but I don't want it to be as solid of a application as my solid wash. So I definitely want a thinner layer of paint on there when I apply this. And I'm going to let that dry. So my next step is I'm going to come over here to Graded Wash. It's also Gradated Wash. I think this is more the technical term, but you will hear people call it Graded Wash. And for this one, what I want to do is apply the beginnings of a wash. And then I'm going to dip my paintbrush into water and overlapping, just continue to thin out that pigment and paint as I come down. So it should be a little bit more of a pigment at the top, and this is one where you could possibly tilt your paper a little bit to help that pigment kind of bleed down into each other. Here I'm getting a little bit of a puddle, so I'm going to pick up some of that water. And we're just trying to get it to get a gradient through here. After my graded wash, I'm going to come down here to the wet on wet technique. And for this one, I'm going to just work on the top part, the wet on wet. And I want to apply first water to my paper. And wet on wet is just the process of wetting your paper first and applying wet paint to the wet paper. Now you can brush the paint in there, you can pick up bits of paint and tap them in. But notice that compared to when we worked with dry paper with wet paint on top, you will get the pigment flowing outwards. You can see it here. It's reaching over, it's flowing, it's following the other wet paint. So wet on wet is a nice technique for creating blends of colors on your watercolor paper instead of just mixing them on a palette. Realize that your colors will be quite light when you do this wet on wet technique, because it does thin out the pigment even more, because you're applying an already thinned out pigment to a wet surface. So that's just more water being mixed in with your pigment, so it will lighten when it dries, and most watercolors do lighten as they dry. My next section is going to be drop color on wet color. So this one I'm again going to start with a color first. And while this is wet, I can drop other wet colors into it. So again, it's another way in which you can mix colors together on your canvas, on your watercolor paper. To create new colors or gradients of color from one color to another. So it gives you an opportunity to create just interesting looks, textures, or possibly even adjust some colors. Even if I add a dark color in there. And just like wet on wet, the wet paint will flow into areas that are already wet. And allow it to kind of mix and bleed. My last technique for today is going to be dry brush. And dry brush is it's kind of a difficult technique to work with. We're working with watercolor, so you're working with very wet material as it is. The goal with dry brush is to have very little moisture on your paintbrush You want to use a little bit more the side of your paintbrush when you do a dry brush. And you want like some gaps and skipping to occur over the surface. So you're going to notice the texture, you're going to have some white areas, you're going to notice the brush strokes. So those are all the techniques we are going to go over today. I was lifting my paper up here to help move those puddles around, and one color dropped over to another. So that's one other thing I want to mention to you as you move this or go to put this away. Remember, this is watercolor, so if you tip it too much, you could end up with a little accident like I did, in which it will blend one over to the other. In a practice, that's not really going to hurt much, but if this was your good project, that might be something you would be devastated at. So do be careful when working with watercolor. You would like to see it kind of be set up or dry. So if you can, when you work in an area that it can set for a while. But those are the techniques we're going to go over today. Tomorrow we will continue with our practices and fill in more of our watercolor technique chart.